Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our August monthly. We'll give folks a couple minutes to trickle in. But in the meantime, we're very excited to welcome this month's guest, Glade Sowards. Glade is a senior policy analyst with the Utah Division of Air Quality, where he's worked on various roles for about 19 years, including serving as the Clean Power Plan coordinator and as part of Utah's delegation to the Western Climate Initiative. Currently, he serves as the coordinator for the Beehive Emission Reduction Plan, a plan aimed at identifying and implementing emission reduction strategies for the state of Utah. Previously, he also worked for the Utah Energy Office, now the Utah Office of Energy Development, where he managed the technical analysis section. And today, he's here to talk us through how Utah has been participating in the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, or CPRG. So for those of you who are not familiar with CPRG, this was a program that was authorized by the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. It's something that we track closely on the portal. It provides nearly $5 billion in grants to states, local governments and municipalities, tribes, and territories to develop and implement ambitious plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful air pollution. In the fall of last year, 2023, the EPA gave states, municipalities, tribes, and territories about $250 million in funding to develop their climate action plans. Recently, then the EPA followed up those awards with about $4.3 billion in funding to different applicants to implement those plans. 25 applicants received implementation grants so far. This included about 13 state applicants, 11 municipalities, and 1 tribal applicant so far, though we expect more tribal awards to come in the coming months. And Utah was one of those winners. So today we're lucky enough to get to chat with Glade about that award. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Jacqueline, who I think many of you are familiar with, and she's going to run us through some questions.
Great, thanks, Annabelle, and thank you all for joining us today. So we got a lot of questions, so I want to dive right in. So Glade, Utah has been working on climate planning for quite a while now. In fact, this Priority Climate Action Plan, or PCAP, is going to be the 4th planning initiative that the state has put out, and it's unique that it's the first planning initiative that specifically sought funding through the CPRG implementation grants, making it more actionable. Can you talk a bit more about developing Utah's PCAP and what the state's primary goals for climate action are?
Yeah. So yeah, you mentioned those past climate planning initiatives, and I just happen to be lucky or unlucky to have been involved with all of them. No, I'm definitely lucky. I worked at the Energy Office, as was mentioned before, where we did a study with the EPA back in around 2000. And more recently, we worked with, under the former Governor John Huntsman's administration, we did something called the Blue Ribbon Advisory Council on Climate Change. And then more recently, a legislatively funded climate planning effort in like about 2019, 2020. And through all of those, we've kind of evolved in our thinking, about what we would want to have in a climate plan. We tackled big kind of, policy issues and kind of big picture stuff in some of those earlier planning efforts. And I think that was good, but the PCAP was unique in that it had funding associated with it. Sorry, the CPRG was unique in that it had funding associated with it, that $4.3 billion in competitive grant funding, and kind of really focused us on a kind of a different trajectory, like to look at actionable measures that we could match up to funding, maybe not be quite as ambitious, but try to get some wins early on. And so we tried to build on those past planning initiatives. So there were climate, we've done these climate initiatives. We also have periodically energy plans or natural resource planning efforts in the state. And there's sort of some themes our staff went through in these different past documents. And, we're a conservative state. So some of the themes are things like an any of the above approach to energy and natural resources, a market, market-based focus, being innovative, cost-effective, focus on reliable and affordable energy, preference for incentives over mandates. So it's important that our plan be voluntary in nature, and then involving local leaders and decision makers. So we wanted it to really be state focused, and that's part of the reason we branded it instead of calling it the Utah CPRG program, where we emphasize climate. We talked about we call it the Beehive Emission Reduction Plan. We're the Beehive state. We also have several non-attainment areas in the state for criteria pollutants, in particular here along the Wasatch Front. And we wanted to make sure when we were talking about emissions that we were also covering criteria pollutants and precursors, things like NOx and PM 2.5 and VOCs, et cetera. So.
Awesome. Yeah. And you mentioned all those different initiatives that you're putting out there in the plan. I'm wondering, like, my next question kind of related to that. Were there any like challenging parts of developing this plan? Any lessons that you learned from that?
Yeah, some of this gets into the CPRG weeds. So I don't know the mix of folks who are on the call. I know that this, the monthly involves kind of a broader set of federal funding opportunities from the IRA and the IIJA. But a little background on the CPRG, you had to do a priority plan by March 1st of this year, and then EPA gave us a whole month to turn in an application or applications for implementation grant funding. But your measures you selected had to make it into your PCAP before you could apply for them in an implementation grant application. And EPA wanted things to be, the measures to be quantifiable, and yet they needed to be broad enough that other eligible entities in your state could apply under your PCAP. So there were more than just the lead agency for the planning grant could apply for measures in your PCAP. And so there was this challenge for us of how do you make it specific enough that you can quantify it and have it be actionable and implementable, but still broad enough that another agency could say, we'd like to do something in that under that measure. So we kind of, we didn't ask permission. We just went ahead and selected several measures that were really quite broad, supporting electric vehicles, supporting EV charging infrastructure, addressing industrial emissions. And we got a little more specific than that. But then within each of those broad measure headings, we had one or more example projects that really kind of got into the weeds and talked about how many units of each type of equipment we would incentivize, the level of the incentive, the emissions associated with each of them. So we kind of tried to thread that needle between being broad and specific. Also, some of our PCAP measures didn't end up getting included in our in DAQ's final application. We made our PCAP broad enough, like I said, so that other sister agencies in the state, like our Department of Transportation, could apply. And we also spread some of our PCAP measures into other applications. So we joined a multi-state coalition application with the state of Hawaii and several other states for resilient local energy, mainly a solar and storage initiative. And so we had that in our PCAP, but we kind of diversified in that way. So we had some measures in our DAQ application, maybe a measure in the coalition application, and some spread out with other agencies. And that was kind of hedging our bets. So you mentioned that Utah was lucky in that we were selected for one of our applications, but that also means we were unlucky in some other categories. So we didn't get funding for every measure that we had in our PCAP, but we did get a really good basket of measures funded. I guess the last thing I would say is, we, in trying to narrow that list down, a lot of the things just didn't end up making the final cut. We didn't have enough information maybe by the time our application was due, or we lost some partners due to some of the peculiarities of the CPRG, namely the Davis-Bacon Act requirements relating to construction spooked away some of our partners in the 11th hour. And so some measures are going to get reserved, they're held over for our comprehensive plan, which we'll talk about, I think, in a minute on the call.
Yeah, awesome. So now that the PCAP is done, that's when the real work begins with implementation. And you mentioned that Utah was awarded, congrats by the way, $74.7 million for the implementation grants. And this is going to be supporting the state's Beehive emissions reduction plan, a name I love, by the way. Can you walk us through some of the initiatives in this plan?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of them here, and I'll give you the broad headings and then talk about some of the particulars. So we had several measures. So almost all of these, with a few exceptions that I'll note, were related. They're basically incentive programs to encourage parties to purchase certain types of equipment and install them if necessary, and get the emissions reduction benefit of that. So we had several related to electric vehicles. One specifically related to we call it EV RAP, or EV Replacement and Assistance Program. We have, like many states, we have vehicle inspection and maintenance programs for your emissions testing that you have to do annually in a lot of urban areas. And when people fail a test, historically, if they were low income, we might help them with a repair voucher or waiver to help them get their vehicle repaired. And we realized we had been repairing these old internal combustion engines that are sometimes 20, 25 years old, tier 1 or tier 0 emissions standards. And so we're repairing old dirty cars back to being old and dirty and barely functional. And so we had originally gotten some funding from EPA through another program to start helping buy people into cleaner tiered internal combustion engines, or ideally into EVs. And we'd had some success in that regard. So we funded kind of an extension of that original VRAP program, which is Vehicle Repair and Replacement Assistance, to EV RAP. So this new funding money from the CPRG will help us when low income folks fail their test. We can buy them into a newer used electric vehicle at a pretty with a pretty large incentive depending on their income level. We also had some just more generic programs. We had a light duty EV fleet vehicle program to help municipalities and maybe businesses get EVs into their fleet. Delivery vehicle incentive program, so sort of a medium duty van or delivery truck incentive program. Programs for refuse haulers, funding for 30 school buses, 7 electric transit buses. So that's the EVs. And I guess I'll throw in there with that, we did an e-bike program to help folks with e-bikes. And that, again, has an income specific component. So you get a higher incentive at lower income. Let's see, we also did a couple of charging programs, one for workplace and multifamily dwellings. So folks who don't have a single family home where they can install a charger could still charge an electric vehicle. We also have a fleet EV charger incentive program to help those same fleets I talked about earlier get the charging infrastructure they need. And then we get to some, we're also doing an electric vehicle or electric yard equipment program for things like string trimmers, weed eaters. We joke that that's sort of the gateway drug into electric vehicles, if it kind of demystifies people being able to try an electric piece of equipment and experience some of the benefits of like not worrying about it starting or blowing smoke or being really noisy. So we're excited about that, and that helps us with our criteria pollutants in our ozone non-attainment area. Then we have a unique program in our oil and gas sector to replace thief hatches, which are, it's a long story, but they're hatches on tanks that are used for measurement and also pressure relief that sometimes can get left open. And they emit a lot of VOCs and a lot of methane. Of course, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. So we want to replace older versions of those that are make it hard. So we'd make it harder for those to be accidentally left open, that they would kind of positively latch and give us benefits. We also have an ozone non-attainment area that's associated with our oil and gas sector in eastern Utah. And so this is aimed at both the methane, but also those VOCs that are precursors to our ozone problem there. Finally, we have 2 programs through some of our state universities. The University of Utah runs a industrial assessment center. These are industrial assessment centers are set up through the U.S. Department of Energy. And they utilize graduate and professional students to help commercial and industrial facilities prioritize energy efficiency projects, find those that are going to have the shortest payback, and then those projects those operators of those facilities can seek funding through various sources to get those projects undertaken, and they've had pretty good luck with that. They recently lost a utility, ratepayer based funding stream that helped them with their program. So we're replacing that ratepayer funding stream with CPRG funding. And then finally, we're funding sort of a one-stop shop at Weber State University in kind of northern Utah. They've set up a sustainability home, kind of a demonstration home. And if we're going to staff that home through CPRG funding for a 5-year period to help them provide kind of energy coaching. So if you're someone that wants to learn about energy efficiency and kind of navigate all of the incentives and different types of programs that are out there, they can help show you the technology, what's ideal in a house, sit you down and help you find what might work for you. So it's we're kind of piloting that program. I think I covered everything, but that's it in a nutshell.
Awesome. That's really great information. Thanks for sharing all that. So there's a lot of funding for climate projects within the IIJA and the IRA, in addition to the CPRG. How will this funding fill gaps or complement other federal funds that are flowing into Utah?
Yeah, so that's a great question. For those who aren't familiar with CPRG, and there are 3 deliverables: a PCAP, a comprehensive plan or CCAP, and then a status report. And each of those have different required plan elements. And among those plan elements, one of the things the EPA wanted us to do is evaluate the intersection with other federal funding. So this exact question it was a requirement of the program that we go out and try to find other funding sources, whether it's federal funding, state funding, private, whatever it might be. And we actually use the Atlas spreadsheet database, I guess, of these IRA and IIJA funding sources to set up our own Utah version. It was called the Funding Resource Guide that we share with stakeholders. And we literally ask stakeholders, hey, are you aware of these? Are you applying for any of them? Can we kind of coordinate on this? And that sort of was the genesis of our measures list that we ultimately kind of narrowed down for our PCAP. So I guess what I'd say is by design, we had those other funding sources in mind, and it was really helpful for us to have the Atlas portal list, database to help identify those. And that work is going to be ongoing as we move into our CCAP.
Yeah, and I'm glad the climate program portal has been helpful for your work too. It's important that we get the word out there and make sure that all these initiatives are in place. So want to pivot a bit. Can you talk more about the expected outcomes of your state's plan?
Yeah, so obviously I walked through that kind of exhaustive list of measures. Clearly, we want to deploy the different equipment types that we talked about, and achieve the numbers that we included in our grants application to EPA. So we want to make sure we get the number of EVs, the number of chargers, and things like that. But obviously, that's not the end goal. We want to get the emissions benefits from that, right? So we want to get the greenhouse gas, but also, as I mentioned, the criteria pollutant benefits that are important for our non-attainment areas. We also think, again, I think none of these were earth-shatteringly new. I mean, people listening on the call who probably went through this process, other than a couple novel things like our Thief Hatch program, they're very common to what a lot of folks went for. And maybe we didn't go super big. We wanted to live. It's a competitive process. The CPRG was awarded in tiers, depending on the amount of money you asked for. And we wanted to stay kind of in the mid-pack level of tier rating because we didn't want to be competing with giant states or big coalition applications. And so it maybe seems a little not that earth-shattering, the stuff we went after, but I think it helps to get that out there and get it deployed sooner rather than later and have that kind of injection into our economy. And also just, every time someone gets an EV or you get an e-bike or someone installs solar panels on their house, it's just another example in another neighborhood of like, oh, this is actually happening. I could do that maybe. And so maybe in and of itself, these aren't going to give us huge emission reductions, but we think it'll help get that idea out there and get people more comfortable with it and build on our past programs. And hopefully we can extend that with our CCAP.
Awesome. So all the funded measures in your plan contain like direct or indirect benefits to low income and disadvantaged communities. Can you speak more about that and what these benefits might entail?
Yeah, I probably covered that a little bit. I mentioned the EV wrap program was very much directly related to income level to get people into newer used EVs. One thing I failed to mention is we may extend that program beyond just failing vehicles, but based on a similar program we've seen in the state of Colorado. I think it's called their vehicle exchange program. We may also just do an income based incentive to spread beyond the areas of the state. Not all counties in our state require inspection and maintenance programs. We want to make sure that the LIDAC community in our rural areas that don't have emissions testing could also benefit. So we're working with EPA on that. But then some of these have either indirect or direct benefits. Clean school buses, adding 30 additional EV school buses we think has a LIDAC component to it. And we also in that we didn't quite go with the full number of school districts in the state, but we targeted enough buses that districts who have not yet been successful through other school bus funding programs could at least get one bus and try it out and get comfortable with it, and hopefully extend that benefit into some of the lower income portions of the state or rural areas that maybe have had disadvantages in the past. I mentioned the workplace and multifamily charging. We want to get, not everyone can put an EV charger in their garage or has a single family home. And so we want to make sure that they're kind of ubiquitous, and we really want to get them into multifamily dwellings, which are increasingly common in Utah. So we think that'll have low income and disadvantaged community benefits. And then finally, I think I mentioned that some of our remaining incentives, we want to have an income derived incentive level. So things like e-bikes, yard equipment, you'll have a larger incentive if you're in those in a lower income bracket.
Yeah, I think those are all really important points that you made there, especially like with the building sector, with the transportation sector, making sure that these benefits reach all those communities through those projects. So thank you for sharing that. Now, what are the next steps in implementing these measures? Now that you have funding, what can we expect for that timeline? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so we only just met with the EPA about 2 weeks ago. So we up until then, we'd only heard the same announcement that anyone else had about the program. But we met with EPA and our regional office counterparts, and we've got some I's to dot and T's to cross. That it's just kind of a commonplace of moving from the work plan in your application to an executable work plan and a contract and that sort of thing. So there's some clarification items and some stipulations that we're working with EPA to get to revise our work plan, and that sets the stage for us getting funding somewhere in the mid to late October range of this year. And then then we've got to work through some appropriations issues with our legislature here. That's just, they control the purse strings. We want to make sure that everything's good to go. But in the meantime, we're not waiting. We're already thinking through how some of these programs could be implemented. Several are being handled directly through DAQ, which has a grants and incentives section, and some of their staff helped with our implementation grant application and PCAP, so they already are familiar with the program. We're actually we're backfilling some staff positions, but we think we'll be staffing up to accommodate the new funding. So stay tuned for that, because there may be some job opportunities in Utah related to this program. And then we're working through with partners on, we've got, like I mentioned, the 2 university programs. We need to set up our contract and program with them. But hopefully, worst case scenario, if we have to wait to the legislative session, late winter of, kind of January through early March of next year would be the latest. We may be able to get our appropriation approved before then, and we're still kind of learning the details of that. So hopefully we could start spending it, as soon as maybe November, but it might be that we need to wait just a little longer to get our legislative process buttoned down. But we're not waiting. We already have some staff that work in many of these areas. Some of these we already have existing programs. I mentioned the VRAP program. We also had a workplace charging program that was covered through state funding that's exhausted its money. And so that staff person is kind of ready to go. Once we get the new funding for workplace charging and multifamily, they can just hit the ground running. I think that's mostly it. We also want to make sure that the measures we have are complementary with other funding sources. And so, for example, our energy office received a $62.5 million Solar for All grant. And one thing I neglected to mention, we do have a solar panel incentive program among the measures. I just forgot to mention that one. And we need to make sure that our solar panel incentives play nice with Solar for All. So we're working with EPA on how we would do that so that we meet the spirit of our work plan, but we also sort of accommodate this new development that the state has got Solar for All money. So we want to make sure that everything is complementary, that there's no, you can't have stacking on the same piece of equipment with federal dollars, things like that. So I think that's everything there.
Awesome. So applicants are going to go through a second planning phase for their comprehensive climate action plan, or the CCAP, which are due like 2 years after the planning grant award, or about like mid 2025. And we've also heard that there might be a deadline extension for those to December. Don't know if you can confirm that or not, but can you tell us what's next for your state CCAP?
Yes, mercifully, we've heard that we have an extension for the CCAP through December 1st. I know some states that individually applied for an extension, and I think EPA just recognized in general that folks were struggling. The PCAP was pretty tough, and the implementation grant application deadlines were really tight. And I think there was a period of recovery that was needed, but also a lot of states, and Utah included, are procuring third-party assistance for things like quantification and maybe stakeholder engagement for this broader CCAP effort. So yeah, we're grateful for the extra time, and that's what we've been working on, is procuring some help with our quantification, our projections, our inventory, measure quantification, that sort of thing. And as far as the CCAP goes, we had originally thought we'll cover these sort of short-term incentive type programs in the PCAP, and then we'll save the big thorny policy issues like updated renewables portfolio standards, or generation performance standards, or power plant closure dates, or whether a state joins the California Advanced Clean Trucks program or something like that. Reserve those for the CCAP. And while maybe some of that stuff isn't entirely off the table, I think our focus has shifted or evolved. We're now looking at the CCAP in some ways as a very big PCAP, where now the funding source wouldn't be the $4.3 billion in implementation grant funding, but would be the remaining programs under the IRA, the IIJA, things like directed or elective pay, tax credits, loan programs, green bank, green financing opportunities. So we are really starting to look at the CCAP as we still want to go after discrete, actionable, quantifiable measures, not just big pie in the sky, have more EVs or more renewables. We want to be much more specific to specific projects and try to match them up with, agencies or organizations or entities to pursue those and lead those measures and match it up with funding sources. So in some ways, we're viewing our role as almost like the conveners network that Atlas is a part of. We want to sort of be the conveners for Utah to bring together state, local, tribal, nonprofit, and other entities, private sector entities, to try to get actionable measures under the CCAP. So we will shoot for that December 1st timeframe, but we'll probably have our kind of a CCAP kickoff this fall and start to break out into some working groups, probably mostly along sector lines, but also with a low-income and disadvantaged community working group, and maybe a cross-cutting issues kind of working group to try to start to match up our project list with funding with those who can implement them.
Awesome. Yeah, and I see a related question about CCAPs. Does this CCAP extension apply to MSAs as well, or is this just an option for the states?
That is a great question. I think it does apply to MSAs, but you would want to confirm that. I think if you just go to the CPRG implementation grant, sorry, planning grant website, they would hopefully have that updated information. And I know I've got a couple of my colleagues on the call. If one of you have an answer to that, feel free to hit in the chat.
Great. And we covered a lot in this call today, but is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that we didn't cover, anything we might have missed?
And I kind of hinted at it earlier. The Atlas portal was super helpful for us in identifying funding sources, and I think it's going to be helpful going forward. We're still trying to understand, what funding is still left. And the whole stacking and braiding thing is like a never-ending source of confusion for us. So it's helpful to have Atlas. It's helpful to have the conveners network. If some of the folks on the call haven't participated in some of those, webinars and things like that we have with Atlas, I would highly encourage you to get engaged, because it's just really helped us with our program.
Great. And lastly, this is a question we love to ask all our guests. Can you recommend a book, podcast, or a show that's related to climate for our audience?
I will, and this is maybe kind of a stretch. In our pre-meeting before folks joined the call, we talked about some of the folks had visited Utah. You may be familiar with our national parks. We got a lot of public lands here, and I like to go out and river raft and kayak in particular. And so this book, I'm going to recommend a book called The Emerald Mile by an author named Kevin Fedarko, and it's about the nearly catastrophic flooding in 1983, where the Glen Canyon Dam, just south of the Utah border, nearly overtopped. They had to release huge quantities of water through the emergency spillways, which then began to fail, and nearly catastrophically. And so during this time, professional river guides on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon recognized that this was a once in a lifetime opportunity to break the world record for speeding through the canyon on a trip. So the Emerald Mile was the name of the boat that made the world record river run. And it's about that. But what's neat about the book is it's contrasting the sort of personal journey of these river rafters with the huge state of alarm that was happening with the Bureau of Reclamation, with the dam potentially failing. And what's so interesting about it to me, and what brings it back to climate, is now Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam, is so low that it's in danger of the water not even be able to reach the intake tubes for the power plant at the base of the dam. And so in basically 40 years, we've gone from a full reservoir that overtopping to something that may not even work going forward in the future. And interestingly, the Navajo generating station, a coal-fired power plant that was built just adjacent to the dam to help, I believe, pump water to Phoenix and some other things, was recently decommissioned as part of this kind of switch to clean energy. And so it's just kind of an interesting nexus of climate stuff, and it's just a really fun, great read. So, and it recently, I read it before, but it recently came out on audiobook. So if you're ever out here visiting the Mighty Five, our 5 national parks, and driving through southern Utah, this is a good one to put on Audible or whatever your streaming platform is, and just kind of listen, because it gives you some local color for the territory you're driving through.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to check that out. That's awesome. And Annabelle shared the link in the chat to the book, so yeah, check it out. So I'm going to turn it over back to Annabelle to lead our last minute Q&A.
Thanks, Jacqueline. This was super fun for me to listen to. Always exciting to kind of get into you read the actual plan, but then to hear a little bit more about all the details there. So if any of our attendees, if you have any questions for Glade, or any questions about CPRG in general, the process, what we just talked about, please feel free to share them either in the Q&A or in the chat. We had one question about whether or not we'll be posting a recording of the video. We will. We're recording this conversation and we will post it on CPP, and we'll share it via the digest shortly after. I think you'll also get a notification actually, like after this webinar. So if you or any of your colleagues missed some of this conversation and would like to be able to revisit it, you can do so that way. I have a few questions that I just had, so I might start with those. But then I encourage you all to share if you have any other burning questions. So first, my first question was really that a lot of the projects you described are in the transportation and building sector. Are there other sectors that are kind of relevant to carbon emissions in Utah that are more difficult, I guess, to kind of make concrete, discrete targets or activities to fund? Or was there another reason why the focus was on transportation and buildings?
Great question. We actually did in our PCAP have about 3 forestry example projects to address things like forest sequestration and also things like fire management. And we worked with our Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to try to identify measures. And the PCAP and the implementation grant that goes with it had this kind of 5-year period of performance. And you also got kind of more weight for in terms of the scoring for near-term emission reductions from 2025 to 2030. And all of our forestry measures, when we tried to quantify them, which is tough to do anyway, they were showing the CO2 or the sequestration benefits way out into the future, like planting ponderosa stands or things like that might take 50 years maybe to really like give you full benefits. And so we had to make a strategic decision between the PCAP and the implementation grant application to pull back on those because we just didn't think we had strong quantification numbers, especially for the near term. We also had a really interesting project from one of the cement manufacturers who operates here for a declinkerization program to reduce the carbon content of cement, which is one of the well-known, difficult to abate sectors of the economy. So we had a partner ready to go, but they wanted I don't remember, $60 million, something like that. And we just thought that was going to put us into kind of California, New York turf in terms of or coalition grant application turf to really get our, we didn't want to get out over our skis. So we are, though, in fact, I'm meeting with some folks from the cement industry here tomorrow as part of our CCAP. We want to dust that off now and hopefully find some other opportunities either through maybe the U.S. Department of Energy LPO program or some other things we have our eye on. So I guess I'd say we did have some of these other areas involved. Another one we had a lot of buildings measures that I didn't describe, things like pre-weatherization, whole home retrofits, heat pump programs. Those building measures our state partners got a little spooked when the Davis-Bacon stuff it became apparent that would be required. And it's not that folks don't want to pay a prevailing wage necessarily, or that those agencies don't support that. But some of the contractors they've worked with, particularly in the rural areas of our state, have struggled with similar prevailing wage requirements before. And it tends to kind of dry up the pool of contractors they can work with. So we had some more sectors covered in our PCAP than it made it in our implementation grant application.
I know these processes are difficult, so it's interesting to hear about how like the iterations can kind of like tackle some of the low-hanging fruit quickly, and then you also have this longer planning process where you can dig back into maybe some of the more difficult to achieve kind of goals too. So that's great. We have a few questions. I was going to, Alice Main, I was going to unmute you really quick if you wanted to ask your question. I think I can do that. Maybe I can't. Okay, I was trying to enable your mic and camera, but I don't think I can. So if you had, oh yes, okay.
Okay, cool. Oh, sorry. Well, I'm experimenting with a new desk. My name's Alice. I work over this at the city of Albuquerque over in New Mexico. We did not receive our implementation grant, but it's been really great to hear your thought process for selecting those projects, because that was something that we found became actually pretty political, especially at the MSA level, because we had counselors that had projects in there. We had different directors getting involved. Like, it's really, really awesome. So I really appreciate that you kind of unveiling your decision-making process around how you made those strategic choices. But my question around this CCAP is, are you utilizing any like strategic planning frameworks in your project development, or getting a better idea of what kind of the big needs are in your state? I come from like a business background, business and strategic plan background, and so I'm curious if you're using any like SWOT analyses or things like that to make sure that you're addressing the biggest needs and the biggest impact in your state.
Great question. And I think the answer is probably not quite yet. We are working to select a vendor to help us with, I mentioned our quantification, but also our engagement. And some of the, we haven't finalized anything yet, but some of those parties have had pretty extensive public engagement experience in the past. I keep using this word in all of my calls on this topic, but the PCAP and the implementation grant application, and even this first part of the CCAP, has been sort of a triage thing. We're just kind of hitting it wherever we can. The best we did was we did what we call homework assignments at some stakeholder meetings and some agency coordination meetings, where we just simply made a Google form and kind of gave them some questions that we wanted to get a sense of how familiar they were with some of these funding opportunities, where they're already pursuing them, ideas they had for strategies, through which we got, I think, 133, something like that, measure ideas from stakeholders and other agencies. But it was not kind of like an MBA derived process that we used to do that. I think there are probably some more sophisticated tools we could use for that. We are kind of eyeing, like I said, sort of sector type breakouts going forward. And we also, I believe it was maybe not Albuquerque, but maybe the state of New Mexico has done some RFIs recently related to so requesting ideas for some kind of concrete projects. And so we saw that and are interested in that approach. So we're still working on it. I think we will have we'll have some more tools at our disposal, but hopefully our contractor can help us with some of that.
Terrific. All right. Thanks, Alice. I've got like 4 questions, I think, here in the queue for the Q&A. We'll try to move through in the next like 5-ish minutes. So the first one's sort of related to what you were talking about, but on the public and community side, we have a question from Kyla about what your process for like public and community engagement looked like, maybe how you're hoping to engage communities as you plan the CCAP, challenges, successes, especially any successes in rural communities.
Yeah, great question. And again, some of that is kind of TBD as we're working to get our vendor selected. What we have been doing in the meantime, as we've become aware of, there's a lot of these funding deadlines, application deadlines and things for different funding sources that have been coming at us pretty fast. And so while we're waiting to get our more formal process set up, we are trying not to let any of these slip by. So when we see an application deadline coming up for, clean ports funding or for heavy duty vehicle program funding, trying to think of some other examples, the transmission siting and economic development grant program, charging and fueling infrastructure funding. We've been making sure that somebody in our state is taking the lead on each of those. So we're kind of convening ad hoc meetings just to get the key players on the call and see if who's kind of most best positioned to apply for those, and then support them in that effort. But again, that's very ad hoc. We want to get to a more formal kind of public engagement process, and we're still working out the particulars on
Great. Well, it'll be exciting to see how that develops. Could you talk, next question is from Carter Harms. Could you talk a bit more about any legislative action that is needed to start spending the CPRG funding in Utah?
Yeah, ultimately the legislature controls the purse strings, and we have at the appropriate times, there's sort of an interplay that happens between the executive branch and the legislative branch. We've tried to keep folks aware as we were first getting the planning grant money last year. We went to legislative leadership, and we also Utah has a body, kind of a bipartisan legislative informal group, I guess, called the Clean Air Caucus. So we were engaging with the Clean Air Caucus to kind of keep them apprised of how our project was going along. And we just tried to be as transparent and communicative as we could be throughout the process. In a conservative state, not every legislator supports some kind of climate actions per se, I guess, or things that are nominally climate actions. And so we've really tried to emphasize this being a Utah stakeholder-driven plan. We got a lot of our ideas straight out of rural Utah, straight from local health departments, local county officials, city officials, things like that. All of that is helping, but we do need to go through the formal process, and we've whenever it's appropriate. We only found out we got selected a handful of weeks ago, but we've communicated that to our governor's office, and now we're working through that process just to make sure that we're good to go when we get the funding.
Great. On a slightly different topic, I have a question from Dallas Blaney about if you have any insights about how you guys are working to increase the drawdown of direct pay in Utah.
Great question. We've been learning more about that lately and realizing that that's one of the more fruitful routes that we think we could go. We noticed that I think it's the state of Michigan has had some kind of roundtables where they've been going around the state to help educate folks about direct pay and some of the other options that exist. And we were thinking of doing something like that here. So we are also participating in a boot camp that RMI is hosting. Just happens to be they're hosting it in Salt Lake in September, and so we will participate in that. But we want to be. I don't know if I think I saw her on the call, but CJ Johnson from our shop is kind of going to be our direct pay lead. And so we've sort of given somebody the role to really dig into this, get super familiar with it, so we can hopefully spread the word and educate folks throughout the state. So we hopefully get a good uptake there.
Fantastic. And yeah, I guess if anyone on the call, as a side note, maybe Jacqueline, you can throw the link to Lawyers for Good Government Navigator, but Atlas has just been working on a project with them where we developed the Project Finance Hub alongside Lawyers for Good Government's Direct Pay Navigator, which is intended to help folks that are eligible for direct pay, for tax credits via direct pay, kind of have their hand held through that process to see if their projects are eligible. So that's a really great resource that was launched last month for anyone that's not aware of it yet. Okay, thank you. So let's see, I think we had like one or two more questions. One question from Aaron Carpenter, will there be a particular effort to integrate solar with the multifamily and workplace EV charging infrastructure?
We hadn't necessarily envisioned that. I don't think we would preclude that. Certainly that could be a good fit. But we don't have we hadn't had that in mind in particular when we developed that. We did have, when we were applying under the Hawaii-led multi-state coalition application for resilient local energy, we had envisioned a project with the Utah Transit Authority, which is our major metropolitan transit provider along the Wasatch Front, kind of like Salt Lake, Provo, Ogden area in Utah. We were going to hopefully put a solar microgrid on their electric bus garage. So a big version of what you're talking about. Through that funding, we had kind of in our minds at least earmarked maybe about $10 million of the 30 million we hope to get through the coalition application for that. Unfortunately, you know, Utah is in the winner category and the loser category. We didn't get all of our applications funded. We were super excited to have gotten our DAQ application funded, but we're going to have to get creative now with projects like the UTA microgrid project.
Fantastic. And then I think we have time for one more question. We're technically like 5 minutes over, but we can do this one quickly. Thank you all for the questions. I never want to cut the Q&A short if we can help it. Our last question is, we mentioned that there's a 5-year timeline for cost benefit accounting. And we know that batteries last a lot longer than 5 years. So do you have any thoughts about what will be done with batteries after their lifespan, after the conclusion of some of these programs?
You know, it's a really good question, and I'll be honest, I don't think we had thought through to that extent. There's a lot of different angles that, you know, where folks are coming at to kind of electrify the vehicle fleet and maybe even things like battery storage for renewables. And I hopefully we will dovetail whatever batteries come out of our incentive programs will kind of feed into that stream, and we'll get some sort of robust way of recycling those. It's a good question. I'm actually kind of glad you mentioned it, because we have to do a waste sector that was one of the areas we didn't cover in the PCAP. So the CCAP, we will be looking at the issue of waste, and that's probably a good one to tee up. So thanks for kind of flagging that for me.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to Glade for being a wonderful guest. We were so excited to have you on, really dive into this plan and some of the projects that are going to come out of it. Like I said, we're going to post a recording of this monthly later today, probably. So please feel free to send it around to anyone you know who maybe wanted to attend but wasn't able to. And we will be definitely sending out some sort of notice about our September monthly, so stay tuned for that.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, and everyone have a good rest of your day.